In our first session, we looked at what the church looks like from the inside out. And now I want to talk about what the church should look like from the outside in. People looking at the church from the community. People looking at the church from the world. In order to do that, I want you to turn to John chapter 13. John 13, if you know John 13. If you know John at all, you know that this is a part of the upper room discourse, right? This is the night right before Jesus' execution. John takes such a unique angle on the details of that night. He doesn't talk at all about communion or the establishment of the Lord's table. He leaves a lot of things out, but we have more instruction that Jesus gave from John's pen than anyone else. John talks about the foot washing that no one else does, and he talks about this issue that we're going to be looking at now deeper than anyone else does as well. John 13, verse 33. Little children, which is just a way of saying, hey guys, and this is his endearing designation to the disciples. I am with you a little while longer. You will seek me, and as I've said to the Jews, now I also say to you, where I'm going, you cannot come. A new commandment I give to you, that you love one another even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another. I want to give you a test. I'm not going to ask you to answer out loud, but I do want to give you a test in your heart, okay? The year is AD 50. You're a Christian, and you want to be faithful to share your testimony of faith with your neighbor. You want to give your neighbor the gospel, okay? An incredible opportunity presents itself. Your neighbor asks you over to have dinner with him and his family. You're excited, you accept, you show up ready to give them the best gift of all. You're going to talk to them about the gospel. When you get there, however, you discover that one of your friends from church is also at the table. They've been invited as well. He's a new believer, and you're so happy to see him. What a great opportunity. Two believers with a private audience with an unbeliever. Can you think of anything better? Dinner starts. The servant brings out some choice cuts of steak. The smell is intoxicating. It's wonderful. You can hardly wait to dig in. Probably ribeye. That's the best cut of steak. Then your friend from church at the end of the table asks a simple question of the host. Where'd you get the steak? It smells wonderful. Ha, he says, from the back butcher at the temple of Diana. You see, that's where animals were sacrificed in the temple and sold out back. It was the butcher and the temple at the same time. Your friend turns to you from church, and he is as white as a sheet. He is pale. Blood has left his face. And he says to you in whispered tones, I can't eat this meat because it was offered to an idol. It doesn't bother you. You're like Paul, who said, there is no such idol. There's no God behind it. Eat the meat. The meat's just the meat, right? Doesn't bother your conscience, but it bothers his. Now you're in a pickle. You have to make an instant choice. Am I going to offend my unbelieving host, or am I going to offend my friend who's a Christian whose conscience is bothered? What do you do? Well, some of you are nodding north and south. You know, this is the exact dilemma that Paul talks about in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 27 and following. And his answer comes as a bit of a surprise to many. Paul says, drum roll, Do nothing to offend your brother, even if it offends your unbelieving host. So, whoa, aren't you going to lose your testimony? What's going to happen if you're rude and say, we can't eat this because it's offered to an idol? Or I think that would be fine for me to eat, but my brother can't eat that, and it's going to bother his conscience, so I'm just going to, I need to pass for now. Can I just have some carrots? Or what do you say? How can you possibly get out of that pickle? Paul says you offend the unbelieving host, but you don't offend your believing brother. This is called Christian love. And Paul wants us to know that we are to love other believers not as much as unbelievers. Are you ready for this? More than unbelievers. In fact, the Apostle Paul was really just applying the words of Jesus spoken in the verses here in John 13 at the Last Supper. So a little bit of a review, so we don't drop into these verses uninformed. It's Thursday night of Passover week. Jesus has assembled the 12 disciples to have a final meal, the Passover meal, with full knowledge that he's going to be betrayed and arrested in a few hours, tried overnight, crucified the next morning. And in an act of incredible humility, Jesus washes the feet of the disciples. He instructs them to have the same attitude that he had toward them in washing their feet toward each other. Serve each other. Humble yourself before each other. Then he predicts his betrayal. He identifies Judas as the betrayer, to John and Peter at least. Judas leaves the upper room and goes to turn Jesus in to the officials. Then he says something interesting. He says, now the Son of Man is glorified. How is that the case? Well, I think it's the case because the hourglass for the cross has been turned over. Remember at the wedding, he rebuked his mom and said, now is not the time for me to be glorified. And he said that several times throughout his ministry. Now is not the time for me to be glorified. Now he says it is. What is the glorification? The crucifixion, his death for sin. J.C. Ryle speaks of this unexpected glorification of Jesus and his sufferings and his death with these words. It's worth reading. Ryle says, the crucifixion brought glory to the Father. It glorifies his wisdom, faithfulness, holiness, and love. It showed him wise in providing a plan whereby he could be just and yet the justifier of the ungodly. It showed him faithful in keeping his promise that the seed of the woman should bruise the serpent's head. It showed him holy in requiring his law's demands to be satisfied by our great substitute. It showed him loving in providing such a great mediator, such a redeemer, such a friend for sinful man as his co-eternal Son. The crucifixion brought glory to the Son. It glorified his compassion, his patience, his power. It shows him most compassionate in dying for us, suffering in our stead, allowing himself to be counted as sin and a curse for us, and buying our redemption with the price of his own blood. It showed him most patient in not dying the common death of most men, but in willingly submitting to such pains and none unknown agonies as no mind can conceive, when with a word he could have summoned his Father's angels and been set free. It showed him most powerful in bearing the weight of all the transgressions of the world, in vanquishing Satan, and in despoiling him of his prey. End quote. He's glorified. Judas leaves the room. His instruction intensifies. And now only the faithful 11 are left. That's important because now he can give this instruction which would not have made sense to Judas just a few moments earlier. Of all the things Jesus could have discussed, it's impressive to me, it's impactful to me, that loving others is the head of the list. I don't want to be too melodramatic or even dramatic about it, but if you had your best friends in your room, your family in your room, and you knew you had, a dozen hours left to live, what would be on your mind? What would you talk about? What would you teach? What legacy would you leave them? Well, when I go through the list, what Jesus says here would probably not have been at the top of mind. I would have been self-absorbed. Here's my lessons. Make sure you do this and do that, and remember this and remember what I said. And it would be pretty me-focused. Pray for me and pray it doesn't hurt as bad. And it would have been all my... He knows he's about to be executed by crucifixion. And what's on his mind most? Telling the disciples the greatest commandment, which is to love one another. This was their prime command for fellowship. You say, well, how can you say this is the best command I leave you, the greatest command that I leave you, when he said earlier that loving God is the greatest command, the second is like it to love others. Well, he said the second is like it. These go hand in glove. If you love God, you love others, and you love others because you love God. They go hand in glove. So we're just going to break this passage down into 3 simple sections and have some implications at the end. How should the church look from the outside in? How should the world see us? And it might not be obvious at first, but I think you'll understand as we go through the text. Let's look, number 1, at the context of Christian love. The context of Christian love. Verse 33. Little children, I am with you a little while longer. You will seek me, and as I said to the Jews, now I also say to you, where I'm going, you cannot come. Interesting passage. Interesting insight. With the leaving of Judas, the inauguration of his glory through suffering has begun. The clock is now ticking for his death on the cross. In just a few hours, he is going to be hanging on that cross. They didn't understand. They didn't understand what he was saying. The door had hardly closed behind Judas when he says, I am with you a little while longer. What did he mean by that? Well, what is he saying? Well, just as I told the Jews. Well, if you go back in John 7:33, therefore Jesus said, for a little while longer I am with you. Then I go to him who sent me. John 8:21. Then he said again to them, I go away, and you will seek me and will die in your sin. Where I'm going, you cannot come. John 12:35, Jesus said to them, for a little while longer the light is among you. Walk while you have the light, so that the darkness will not overtake you. What's going on here? Well, it's been 6 months since the Feast of Tabernacle when Jesus told the Jews that he would only be with them a little while longer. Now, 6 months later, he's telling the disciples the same thing. But he's not talking about months and weeks. He's talking about hours. Just look down for a moment. It's just hard to teach this passage without everything that's collateral around it. Peter, just interesting. In verse 36, right after Jesus' teaching on love, Peter said to him, Lord, where are you going? Because he says, I'm not going to be with you very long. And Jesus says, where I'm going, you cannot follow me now, but you will follow me later. Peter said to him, Lord, why can I not follow you now? I will lay down my life for you. Jesus answered, will you lay down your life for me? Truly, truly, I say to you, a rooster will not crow until you deny me 3 times. Terrible chapter break. Terrible chapter break. Because after Jesus says, I'm not going to be with you long, he just rebukes Peter, basically says, you think you're going to be faithful, but you're going to die. Do not let your heart be troubled. Verse 1. Your heart would have been troubled too. Wait a minute, you're leaving? It's dangerous out there. They want your neck. He says, believe in God, believe also in me. He attached his own identity with God the Father. In my Father's house are many, the King James. What does it say? Mansions. Oh, friends, it says apartments. It's dwelling places, rooms. If it were not so, I would have told you, for I go to prepare a place for you. If I go to prepare a place, a room for you, I will come again and receive you to myself. Where I am, there you may be also. And you know the way where I am going. Stop right there. What's going on there? If you've been to Jerusalem, you understand the scenario. The upper room is just a few hundred yards from about 800 yards from the Temple Mount. And Jesus says, I'm going to my Father's house. He had spoken about his Father's house with his disciples many times before. You know what his Father's house was? Not heaven. In their mind, it was the temple. I'm going a half mile to my Father's house. And I'm going to make a room for you, probably those apartments where the sellers and the buyers would be on the southern part of the Temple Mount. I'm going to go make a room for you. They already knew he was the king. They already said, where can we sit when you're on the throne in Jerusalem? They had a very temporal view of this. And where I'm going to go prepare a place for you. And they must have thought, he's going to the temple, he's going to prepare a place, he's going by himself, and he's going to leave us. And then he says, and you know the way I'm going. The word way there is path. You know the direction I'm going. They probably thought he's going to go a half mile to the temple and he's going to leave us. So you know the way to go so that we're not caught and apprehended without him. Verse 5. Thomas. I know we call him Doubting Thomas, but he's Brave Thomas right here. Peter doesn't talk. Peter's still saying, wait a minute, before the rooster crows. I mean, I'm sure he's over in the corner noodling on this stuff. Thomas speaks up. Remember, verse 4, you know the way where I'm going. Thomas said to him, Lord, we do not know where you're going. How do we know how to get there? How do we know the way? Very temporal. I don't think they were thinking about heaven at all. I think they were thinking about getting down the temple where Jesus is going to be Messiah and they're going to be sitting on the right and the left and right there with him. And then Jesus turns the whole thing. Jesus said to him, I am the way. They're saying, which is the path? How do we get there? Jesus is saying, I'm the path. I'm the road. I am the way. And the truth. Whoa, you just got abstract on us. And the life, even bigger. And now he tells them what he's talking about. No one comes, not to the Temple Mount, no one comes to the Father, but through me. Then we don't have time to go on. Then he goes on talking about knowing me and knowing the Father. They were thinking temporally. Jesus was speaking metaphorically about heaven. Well, all that's important because he says, I'm not going to be with you very much longer. They're thinking very horizontally, very, very temporally. That's the context. What's he talking about? He's saying, when I'm not going to be with you very much longer, that my day-by-day physical presence with you is about to cease, but you will be left with a way to live with me. When I taught John 13 to 17, I called it learning how to live with, living with Christ without Christ. In other words, living with him without his physical presence. That's what he's teaching them here. Someday intimacy will not be physical, someday like in just a few weeks, but it will be spiritual. The context for Jesus' command to exercise love here then for his believers is for them to know how to operate in life when he's not there. We also are living in this context with him, without him. Without his physical presence, but with him spiritually. So let's look at the command then. That's the context. I'm going to be leaving soon. What's the command? Number 2, the command for Christian love. A new commandment I give to you, verse 34, that you love one another, even as I have loved you, that you also love one another. This is interesting. Remember the argument that's been going on. The disciples are in an ongoing argument about who is more important. Who's going to sit where? They started it coming up from Jericho, coming up the hill to Jerusalem, and they're talking about it at the table. Where are you going to sit? Well, where are you going to sit? Well, I'm going to sit there. Well, you're going to be behind me, and I'm going to be above you. It's degenerated to a seating chart with Jesus when he becomes king in Jerusalem. But look at what he says. Love each other even as I have loved you. Where do we learn about this? Well, back in Matthew 5, verse 43, you've heard it said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, you love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good. He sends the rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? If you greet only your brothers, what more are you doing to others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Therefore you are perfect. Therefore you are perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. You are to be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. What does that mean? You are to love as he loves. That's the context there. Romans 8:37. In all these things we overwhelmingly conquer through him who loved us. How does Jesus love? I just can never get beyond Romans 5:8. But God, Romans 5:7, he says, someone will hardly die for anyone, but for a good man, someone will dare to die. It's an honorable thing if you die for your friend. They throw a grenade in the barracks. One of the soldiers dives on it, absorbs all the shrapnel, saves his brothers. That's a noble thing. And Paul's saying, that's a good thing that you would die for your friend. And he says, but God didn't do that. God doesn't love that way. God did not dive on the grenade for his friends. But God demonstrates his own love for us in that while we were yet sinners, he died for us. Then in the next verse he says, we were enemies with God. If you want to stretch the illustration, God goes into the enemy camp, sees the grenade on their floor, and dives on it for them. And you know who they are? They are us. We were enemies. God's love is unlike ours. He loves his enemies. If he loves his enemies in salvation offer, how much would he love his friends? You know the passage, he loved them to the end, John 13 says. Revelation 1:5. To him who loves us and released us from our sins by his blood. There's love. The example of Jesus' love is, therefore, to be a perpetual living example for them and for us to follow. And remember John's context, if you go all the way back to verse 1, he's glorifying himself. It's time for him to die. He's going to come back to this theme over and over. John 15:12. This is my commandment, that you love one another just as I have loved you. John 15:17. This I command you, that you love one another. What does this mean? Well, John understood it more than anyone. Who's buried in Grant's tomb? John wrote the Gospel of John. Who wrote 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John? John. Good class. 1 John chapter 3, verse 11. Same man. This is the message which you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. You think you got the message? 1 John 4:7-21 is a whole exposition on loving one another. Romans 12:10, be devoted to one another in brotherly love, give preference and honor to one another. Jesus left a major example and a major command for us in the body to love, to care for one another. What is love? Putting others' interests ahead of your own, caring for their well-being even more than your own. Just a little footnote pastorally, you have to know someone to really love them. So are we doing things in our churches, care groups, small groups, whatever you call them, to get people to know each other so that they'll love each other? It's hard to love someone that you don't know. How can you love? Love is an action. How can you act out your care if you don't know them? It's not possible with mere acquaintances. Love costs. It means setting aside your interests in order to meet the interests and wants of others. It's giving preference to one another according to Romans 12:10. It means giving preference to other believers even over unbelievers. Now you say, whoa, this is getting a little weird, this accent on loving believers. And what about the unbelievers? Now we see, verse 35, the consequence of Christian love. And this is where this is how the church should look to the outside. the consequence of Christian love. Look at the power of this. By this, by what I'm about to say, all men will know that you belong to me. You're my disciples if you love them. Is that what it says? If you care for them. Is that what it says? They will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. Let me say it as simple as I can, men. According to Jesus' own words, our most powerful evangelistic tool to the world is not how we love the world. It's how we love each other. In other words, people should come into our churches and not say, wow, they loved me, as much as they say, they love each other. I would love to be a part of that. And if the church, I'm not going to beat up the church growth movement, but if your focus is on loving unbelievers, and you're not loving each other, then the church, they'll come into the church and be as unloved as the believers themselves. You love each other. An unbeliever should look at us, look at the church with jealousy. I want to be a part of that group. I want to be loved like they love each other. I want to love like they love each other. And see how this is related to what we looked at in Ephesians? It's not based on the handsome and the pretty, the nice or the wealthy. James 2 says you don't do that because of partiality or wealth. We love each other because of Christ, because of the gospel. And people say, what are these people loving each other for? Why are they together? This doesn't make sense, and it doesn't except for Christ. And Jesus said, the world will know that you are mine when you love each other. Turn that over. What will the world think about us in the church if we bicker and fight and don't love each other? You see how important it is that we're not having medicine and culture wars in our pews? That we're shepherding that? That we're making sure that Christ is preeminent, that He is the focus? Put another way, perhaps the most damaging, disinteresting put off any church could make to an unbeliever is when Christians disagree, fight, exercise selfishness to one another. You know, as leaders, that's what we have to shepherd in our churches. To encourage people to care for one another, to love for one another, to look out for one another, even more than an unbeliever. Don't hear me wrong. If you leave and say, yeah, we need to be rude to the visitors and unbelievers and just love each other and they should be, feel like Rudolph and left out of the reindeer games. No. That's not it. We should love them. We should care for them. We should invite them. We should take them out. But it's not that we leave the love for each other in order to give love for an unbeliever. We bring them into our love for each other. And they see that. I didn't make this up, man. Jesus said, they will know you're mine when you love each other. 1 John 3:14. We know that we have passed out of death into life because we have loved the brethren. He who does not love abides in death. Wow. It's the signature of a Christian to love other Christians. 1 John 4:20. If someone says, I love God, and hates his brother, not just another person, but his brother, he is a liar. For the one who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. I don't know how you can get more specific or graphic than that. John's application that he heard Jesus say, that he recorded Jesus saying here in John 13, his application is, if you do not love your brother, you're not saved. How does that work out in church? Well, you have folks in your church, and if they are so bold as to say, I can't stand that person. I don't want to go to the same service as them. We have to help shepherd that. Up to and including, listen, friend, if you can't love them, you're not going to see them in heaven. You're not going to see me in heaven. Because you're not going. That's what John said. If someone says, I love God and hates his brother, he is a liar. He does not love God. For the one who does not love his brother whom he has seen cannot love God whom he has not seen. You see why it was so important for Paul to get the Jews and the Gentile believers to love each other, to fellowship with each other, to care for each other, to be a witness? Can you imagine what that early Roman, Greco-Roman society thought when they went by a house, in some cases a synagogue, where they had been converted, Jews had come to Christ, Gentiles had come to Christ. They were in there worshiping, singing, laughing, eating together. People were scratching their heads going, what is that? That's still the signature of Christian love. So what's our best evangelistic tool to the world? Loving each other in the church. Jesus said that. Love is the supreme test of Christianity. Most think it's faith. No, faith produces love. Our evangelism must be connected with our life in the church with unbelievers. Back to dinner in AD 50. How do you handle that situation? How are you a good witness to your host who's brought you over and served you meat that was sold at the temple of Diana? And you have a choice to offend your offended brother, your weak conscience brother, that's what Paul calls him in 1 Corinthians, or your unbelieving host. You can offend your unbelieving host by loving your brother without being rude and obnoxious. In fact, there's a way you can do it where you're loving both, isn't there? Hey, you know what? I'm sorry. You need to understand that there is no temple that's except the temple of God. There is no God but God. These are idols, and we don't believe there's any truth to this, but it is a conscientious objection to my friend to eat because we're just trying to grow in our understanding and love for Christ. So thank you so much, but I'm going to have vegetables tonight, and I'll skip the meat. And is there a way that we can maybe get together again? You don't have to be obnoxious about it. I shall not eat this wretched meat from Diana's satanic temple, you foul infidel. I mean, that doesn't win anybody to Christ. But you know what? This brother when you guys leave, he's probably going to say, man, that was quite a sacrifice. And even if he is offended, Paul said, if you have a choice, you protect your believing friend. Love, Christian love of the others is the Christian signature. How should the church look to the world? It should look like people who love each other for no other reason but except the gospel. Because there is no other reason. Again, I go back to my church, your church. I mean, look around the pew. Is there anything that should bring y'all together except the gospel? And people should see that and say, these people have an unusual affection for one another. I'm not saying to greet each other with a holy kiss, but that's in the Bible. But there ought to be expressions of love and care. What are we doing to do that? An unbeliever should feel welcome and loved and cared for in our church. But isn't there a real sense where an unbeliever should come into our fellowship and feel like something's missing? I don't have what they have for God, and I don't have what they have for each other. We hear Ephesians, we hear the Lord in John, and I think our takeaway is let's build our relationships in church with the foundation of the gospel and make it practical and applicable in ways that we know about it with each other and that an unbelieving world can understand it from afar. They can also understand it if they come and visit with us. How should the church look from the inside out? We care for each other. How should the church look from the outside in? We care for each other. because of the gospel. Because what's most important to us is Jesus, who he is and what he's done for us. Not our backgrounds, not our skin color, not our socioeconomic status, not whether we got a vaccination or not. What are we doing to shepherd our people towards God's values and away from worldly divisions? I encourage you, pray for you. We don't get sidetracked. We don't get distracted. We keep our eye on the ball. We make much of him. Let me pray. Oh, Father, I'm so convicted again to hear your son say that the world will know that I love you if I love your sheep, brothers and sisters in the church. Will you please help all of us here in this room today to think more specifically how we might apply these truths? For those who are church leaders, how they might lead others in those. But we would all be examples of the gospel being our priority with each other, and of our love for each other being the example to those who might be loved like that if they would embrace your son. Teach us, encourage us, correct us, and convict us. Make us more like your son because of what he said. Pray that these men are pure and holy and above reproach and can find application from these passages in a way that brings you glory and brings them and their churches good. Pray this because of Christ. Amen.